by looking at your bio, I realized that how you ended up building all these great companies, especially Sky TV. And I also believe that you have a strong understanding of technology and you can take a complex concept and explain it in a simplified format. I'm also a big fan of your book, even though there's a lot changed since then, but still fundamentally your book is extremely inspirational to me. So I want you to share with our audience, tell us about yourself.
Okay. Well, first of all, you're very kind on your flattery on the book. I wish more people had bought it, but I appreciate your compliments. You kind of nailed it. I started off as an entrepreneur before I got into investing in companies, and I've been involved with a handful of startups. Again, you're very flattering to point out the successful ones. There is a long list of failures in there too, though we don't evangelize those quite as loudly. But it's been a wonderful run. To your point, I've been a tech guy and a media guy, and I've generally made my living straddling the fence between the two. And so my life really works between a Madison Avenue, New York City ad guy and a Silicon Valley tech startup role. And I've enjoyed that because they're two disciplines that I really appreciate.
I've been recently working with some MBA student who wants to open their own business. I'm working with the Columbia University Business School. And during that time, one of the questions always comes in. They're asking what makes a company successful, or what makes an individual successful. So share with us what made you successful.
Yeah, I think it's a lot easier for me to define success from an individual's perspective than it can a company. There's so many variables with a company, whether it's timing and market need and just a host of different control levers. You know, from an individual perspective, more times than not, mine has been found through inspiration, motivation, some of those old cliches, drive, and maybe in some instances, desperation. But it's usually with the entrepreneurial set with which I tend to mix and mingle, there's a lot of startup, bootstrap sort of stories in my portfolio of relationships. And I think more times than not, the key driver, at least that I've been able to identify, has been just that, a strong burning desire to succeed, to find a better lot in life. But at the end of the day, I think it's more about inspiration than it is anything else.
How do you define right people when you hire people for your own portfolio company, or when you hired people for Sky TV and other company you had in the past?
I think in many instances it depends on what type of business that you're in, because you're dealing with different personality sets from, say, a creative enterprise to maybe a more strict discipline. But ultimately, if you can find that element of passion, that's such a motivating factor. It's challenging, though, to find that level of enthusiasm down the line from the top of the company. And again, I think that starts with inspired leadership at the top. It's challenging to articulate that throughout an organization. It's even more challenging to get buy-in. But I think this is the quota that defines, great companies from good companies. I'd like to say there's a magic formula and that I've figured it out. I haven't. I've had as many poor decisions, I think, particularly early on, as really good ones. But as it relates to senior management, I've been blessed to have very talented, motivated people who shared my enthusiasm. And probably the greatest lesson I learned was delegation, was once you have those terrific people, learning how to hand things off as a, at times, megalomaniacal CEO can be difficult for all of us. But finding enthusiastic, great leadership, particularly at your first lieutenant and chain of command level, delegating those people and trying to orchestrate that enthusiasm down channel. Easier said than done, but it really does begin at the top.
How do you define leadership, and what makes a great leader?
Not all of your leaders are going to be charismatic. They're not going to all be phenomenal communicators. But if they have this enthusiasm or passion for the business, that generally tends to be infectious. So again, I'll go back to that theme. But I think number two is you get down to character. I mean, leaders have to aspire to a greater calling. I think we all have a little additional responsibility to try to lead with character. So if I had to define two traits, it would be those. It would be character and again, inspiration and passion.
Leaders are born or they're made? Can you learn how to lead effectively?
Yeah, that's another great question. I suspect it's some combination of the two. certainly have learned lessons in my life that have molded and defined my character. I think a good bit of that is probably developed early on. Where you find that passion and inspiration, I don't know. Do you grow up on the bad side of the tracks with a burning desire to have a better place in the world that fuels you? Did you grow up on the other side of the equation with a life of luxury that you're desperate not to lose? I'm not sure you can road map where that inspiration comes from. I do think on the character side of the equation, I think the lion's share of that is probably molded in us as young people. We've all seen it in our business. You've seen it many times. Character is that thing that we do when no one is watching, and that is more challenging to find great charactered leaders than simply finding inspired leaders. But I'm not sure I know which of the two.
So can you share with our audience some of your past failures, whether individual and company failures, and how those failures helped you to shape your life and guide your current decision, business and personal decisions?
Well, listen, I failed miserably at being a rock guitar player, because that was my real aspiration in life, was to be Joe Perry of Aerosmith. Failing in that endeavor, however, I was not a great student either. Because of my creative aspirations as a teen, I was a really, really bad student, and it almost cost me a lot of opportunity. Fortunately, I managed to work that out 11th hour and wound up in college and went on my way. But first and foremost, I was a miserable failure as a student and really didn't prepare myself for any kind of metrics for success going forward. College, I was again sort of a very average student because I was juggling full-time work and school and missed a lot of opportunities to learn my first pass, which I wish I'd had an opportunity to take advantage of. So I think those two, educationally, I was not a great academic, suffice to say. But I was fortunate enough to really find a fabulous job right out of school. One of my most successful quests was, despite poor grades, despite not having had the luxury to take on an internship, I literally stormed my way through the door and just persisted to a point that I ended up getting this job that was available at the Wall Street Journal, which sort of launched my career. So again, sort of in this scenario, persistence made up for a lot of my academic shortcomings, and I was able to whitewash my failures, I guess, previously with that first job. But listen, I had lots of failures along the way. I was one of the first people to start selling computers in the early days of the PC era. I had lived down the hall from Michael Dell and knew a little bit about Dell Computer and thought maybe I could do something similar, and literally used to have a collection of kids that would go out at 6 o'clock in the evening at dinner time and ring doorbells and try to sell computers door to door when I was very early on the home market. Now, I sold a lot of computers, but the model itself was doomed to fail, completely unscalable and a bit of a nightmare. So I had plenty of startups that didn't exactly take me to pots of gold. Actually, I guess it is worth footnoting, I did sell that business for a decent amount of money as a young 20-something. So I was on the right path, just the wrong execution. But I've had a host of failed entities, startups. I raised roughly $20 million to do a rich media startup on the heels of broadcast.com. Being a big fan of Mark Cuban's, I thought I had a smarter, better method, and I think history has shown who had the smarter, better method. So I had plenty of the failures during my startup reign, but each and every one of them led to some eventual success. And even if it didn't have a linear connection to some positive outcome, I learned something through the process that brought me full circle. And so, to be honest with you, Russell, I don't really look at those as failures. It's so easy to look at a scorecard and judge which of them were your failures and which one your successes. Ultimately, and maybe I'm just singing Pollyanna, but ultimately they all prove to be worthwhile endeavors. I'm much more acute to probably some of my failures in leadership, along the way. And a lot of that's just a natural, curve of maturation, but lots of mistakes. So easy today in hindsight to talk about character leadership and inspired leadership and the benefits of delegation. Those were not innate qualities, at least on the delegation front and sometimes on the inspiration front, but rather skills learned. So I would say my path is littered with both, but I prefer to look at those failures themselves as simply shortcuts to some better outcome somewhere else.
Tell us a little bit about one of your projects, Sky TV. What was that all about, and how did
Sure.
you ended up selling that company?
Sure. So Sky TV, I'll have to hit the rewind button. We were the first company ever to do a syndicated show on television around computers and technology. And many of the companies that were advertisers on that show were previous relationships that I had in San Francisco when I was with the Wall Street Journal. I started the first show. I was in New York doing a show on CNBC and a host of others. I had a show on Discovery Channel, I had one on Learning Channel, I had CNBC, and I had an in-flight network where we were producing television shows for US-based airlines. And really kind of made my mark as the computer guy, because I was host, I was talent on these shows, and developed a pretty big creative services business out the back door of the business, doing everything from corporate to product video development for the Microsoft and Intels and HPs of the world. It was a couple of years of trial and error, initially hiring freelancers and outsourcing. As the company grew, I started taking on staff and buying equipment, and so it's a very traditional rags to something better story in that regard, and really just learned as I went along. Again, wonderfully talented people, had some creative services directors who were fabulous, had a right-hand man who came from Fox. He was a television guy, a gentleman by the name of Tom Hoitzma, who was my partner for 10 years and just really sort of the best business partner and creative right hand I could have had. So things were going along fabulously. I had a wonderful operation, large studio in Dallas, and Ziff Davis, the publishing company, which we all know from PC Week and the Comdex Computer Convention, et cetera, was about $1 billion New York Stock Exchange company at the time. And they had some aspirations to get into television. We were the largest in technology television, and they had done an IPO the spring before and were sitting on a fairly substantial amount of cash that they were under some pressure to move. So we ended up getting acquired by Ziff Davis, and then immediately, within maybe 30 days, we were pledged in a joint venture with the Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen's investment arm, which is called Vulcan Ventures, to start a television network. Initially called ZDTV for Ziff Davis Television. It changed names to Tech TV and was around for about 4 years. So my motivation for selling, quite frankly, was more transactional than anything else. There was an excitement at the time about building this network, and being a participant or a piece of that was pretty enthusiastic or pretty encouraging. Frankly, had reached a period in the life of that company. I was really eager for something new and to take it to another level. And being brutally honest, the money wasn't bad. So all of those things combined, I sold the company to Ziff Davis in, November of '98. And I stayed with them, helping with the network for about 2 years.
Behind every successful person, there are some people who help them to shape their life. Do you have a lot of mentors, and how did they help you to shape your life?
Yeah, you know, I really had two, technically three. Rick Davis was a gentleman in Houston, Texas, who founded a company called Knight Ridder, not Knight Ridder, the publishing company, but Knight Ridder. And it was an overnight copy service primarily used by the legal trade. And they sold out to Alcoa, a large company, some years later. But Rick was sort of my first real business mentor outside of my father, who I'll address a second. But Rick had built a company of some 90 locations, had built $100+ million market cap company, again, sort of bootstrapped as a serial entrepreneur, and an exceptionally high character guy. I mean, just off the charts. And I had an early financier who was maybe less than a super high character guy. And Rick was really what you would want when you signed up to be partners with someone. And was just fabulous, absolutely fabulous mentor at an early stage in my life. Beyond Rick, I got a lot of what I did know from my father. My father was also a kind of a serial entrepreneur, lots of starts and stops, but ultimately sort of found his way as well. So really the two of them were kind of the guiding force in my business career in terms of having some mentorship.
Did you begin with the end in mind? did you realize when you founded the company that did you wanted to sell it?
No, absolutely circumstance. I did not have a roadmap. I'd like to tell you, Russell, that I'm that detailed and planned, but as the meter tilts, I'm much more on the passionate side of the equation without a lot of the organizational structure, thought, and planning. I tend to sort of shoot from the hip a lot more. And so everything that happened as relates to where the company progressed to, none of that was foreseen in the early days. It was a real simple equation. Tech was booming, or starting to boom. It was happening inside of corporations, but individuals were not yet embracing PCs. Now I'm going way back, I'm going like early 90s. So all of this was just beginning. And there was such a challenge for people to embrace technology when it was new because it was very intimidating. Particularly if you were over 30, it was exceptionally intimidating, right? And so as I got involved, I realized there was a huge need for people to communicate to the masses, and there was no voice, there was no personality related to it. Kind of interesting sidebar, Bob Vila, which does This Old House, the TV show that's been on for 30 years on PBS, was sort of an early inspiration in that I met Bob early, and what he had done as sort of an icon in the home improvement business, he kind of took me under his wing very briefly to teach me a little bit about how the model worked. And so I picked up some real interesting insights that I was really able to extrapolate from home improvement to tech at a time when the business was really taking off. So I would say more good fortune, luck, blessing, however you want to define the circumstance, the positive things that impact our lives, not by our own doing. Whatever the motivation or the source, that's really how things progressed. Never once when I first started did I think I would build an enterprise that I would have an exit strategy that involved selling out to a very large cap New York Stock Exchange company.
So tell us a little bit about your book and why did you write that book in the first place?
Yeah. Well, the idea behind the book was really as we were emerging into this interconnected world during the internet euphoria of about 15 years ago, getting online was opening up a whole new spectrum of possibilities for people, right? This idea that we had one-touch access to this global knowledge, it really created this incredible opportunity for people to start businesses or improve their life personally or professionally. Early on, though, it was still an intimidating process, primarily because of its newness. And the thinking was, I had benefited greatly from some people in this space like Tony Robbins and Dr. Stephen Covey, where I had read their books. And so this whole idea of having a success formula I found to be fascinating. And then the idea that you could map that success formula to this emerging technology we called the internet. It was simply designed to be a guidebook with a collection of success stories that would show people a roadmap to take their heartfelt aspirations, their inspirations, their desires to improve their life, and use this wonderful new tool we call the internet to help you find your way. And so that was the entire motivation behind the book. At the time, I had a successful television franchise, radio franchise, video production, we sort of had 5 or 6 lines of business, and I was very intrigued with going into publishing. Now, the motivation behind the book and the lessons are as spot on today as they were then. The problem with writing a book in the early days of the internet is that the distribution cycle of the publishing business was still old school. Meaning I wrote a book in January, by the time it gets edited, published, distributed to the retail store chain, it's 18 months later. And you and I both know if I write anything about technology, especially the internet during that hyper-accelerated period, 18 months is a lifetime. So we missed, I think, a lot of opportunity by focusing too much on application stories because inherently those applications were a little stale by the time they came to market, and we got kind of caught between that curve of where the publishing industry was at the time. But I think the lessons are intact, and I think most of us gain inspiration from hearing other people's stories. At least I certainly know I do. And the idea that I could see case histories that might inspire me, whether it's weight loss or improving your marital situation or just finding the formula for your financial success in your career, I think we all like to hear from other people that have done it, and that was the kind of the motivation behind the book.
What do you think is the most effective learning method? Because I see some people learn by taking a classroom training or virtual training, some learn by watching videos, some learn by reading a book. What do you think is the most effective learning method?
I'd actually challenge the premise of the question, because I'm not sure there's a most effective learning method. I think it's very individual. This is a very big challenge. I have students, for example, that will approach me in my class who've developed let's just say it's an app. They've developed a new app. They're 20 years old. And they're sitting on the fence with the idea of jumping off the ledge and starting their own business. And they're asking for genuine counseling. Should I quit my 4-year degree and go off and start this business? I don't know that they're learning that's taking place as a coder in the back room. I don't know that they got some of it in their initial computer science classes. I don't know that they're just not a novice who is inspired by some act in their day-to-day life that sent them down a path of curiosity that had them come up with an application or a solution to solve a problem. I don't know where it comes from. And I'm not smart enough to think that I know the formula by which different people find their way to learn. I'm more perplexed with the challenge of how do you guide that student in that environment. I'm less facilitated with tools to figure out where he or she got their learning than I am to try to actually guide them on what they should do next, which, by the way, is an equally perplexing problem, right? I think the simple answer, Russell, is I don't know what learning methods work best. I know what works best in my classroom, okay? For me, there was plenty of ivory tower learning. There's plenty of rote memorization techniques. There's even more contemporary learning styles. For my class, what I found was most effective, and by the way, this is the largest class of its kind anywhere in the country. I have 400 of the brightest business students and communication students and some engineers every week dealing with the topic of technology and marketing and what goes on in the world of trying to market and advertise technology. And quite frankly, it works best by mentorship. I sit on the end of the stage, 2 chairs, I bring in experts from different disciplines and give them something I never got, straight shop talk, right? To have Russell sit in a chair and talk about the world of building an enterprise and to hear your entrepreneurial story and to hear all of the particulars that go into this sector of business that you've developed. That's fascinating material. It's usually an MBA course and it's a special lecture series that you're paying a lot of money for. So I don't know what the formula is. I tend to lead by example, whether it's using success stories in a book that are easy to map to, or whether it's having Russell sit on the stage to talk to my students about your path and how you got there. So much of this to me is formulaic, and so to the degree that I can hear from a successful entrepreneur like Russell or like others in the book, that tends to be the learning style that I've gravitated to, at least as it relates to how I try to give back or share these stories.
How do you define marketing?
A lot of people define marketing very different ways, and I'm not sure, again, it's an easy construct to put into a simple term or phrase, but ultimately it's about getting great products messaged to a market that is interested or needs to develop an interest in your product. Marketing, generally speaking, is messaging. And we can go off on tangents related to brand marketing or product marketing or all the different nuances that go into building affinity for a certain company or a product. Most of the time, it's about great products, okay? And it's about being true to the attributes of those products. I say most because there's a highway that's littered with some pretty lousy products that sold a lot. Ultimately, though, marketing is about finding that true voice for what it is you're selling. What is it that you're selling? And a lot of times the definition of what is being sold is cloudy, okay? Some would say you sell education, okay? I don't think you sell education. I think you sell aspiration. I think you sell success. I think you sell a lot of things that are bundled in a platform that may be learning. But ultimately, you're not really selling learning. You're selling people an opportunity to better themselves. And I think finding those messages, for me, that's the exercise that I find most fascinating. What are we really selling? And once you find what it is you're really selling, once you find what those real attributes are, it's about being true to the voice of that product. If you do that, you're generally successful. Now, there's a lot of other variables related to your success factor, but again, to Drucker's point, it's really about finding great products and marketing those products. And marketing ultimately sort of falls down this spectrum of voice and of messaging. And I think the truer that you can come to center on that exercise, generally speaking, the more successful you are.
Is the CEO brand is going to be different than the company brand, or can you merge them together to promote the organization?
I think they generally have to have some continuity, right? It's very difficult to have a brand strategy around your company that is in complete conflict with the brand of the CEO. So I think to the degree that the CEO plays a front and center role that has visibility, there's got to be continuity. As it relates to brand, listen, there are a lot of studies on what makes a successful brand. And since you mentioned Jobs, I'll use Apple as an example. You think about iPhone, the iPhone launch. Classic example for me. Best product on the market? Arguably. Best product today versus some of the Android options and others? Again, a matter of opinion. The brand affinity, though, for Apple is absolutely off the charts. In fact, by the way, sidebar, almost too good. It's so good that now I'm starting to watch younger generations have a mild amount of Apple backlash because it's become too successful. It's not the hip, irreverent brand anymore, right? That aside, I think brand affinity is really defined in large part by either the ideology behind the company or the differentiating characteristics of the product. Now, in Apple's case, they didn't go on television and start telling you how their product was technically better, although arguably it was. They didn't go on television and tell you how all the design cues on the product were better than anything that had been on the market, though one could argue it certainly was. They didn't take the path of most marketers in the technology world, which is to talk about why inherently our engineers have created something that's faster, better, cooler. They didn't. They really based their entire marketing around one simple premise, okay? And it was that word, simple. And from your or my perspective, they didn't spend multi-million dollars doing animated commercials to showcase the technology of the phone. They laid it on a table. They put a camera to do close-ups. And they used a simple idea. You've got a problem. I've got an app for that. Want to get to find the local grocery store? Got an app for that. Need to find out when the next flight leaving the airport is? I got an app for that. It was brilliant in its simplicity, which said, Russell, it's not about what I've created, right? It's from a customer perspective. It's about how I can help you. And everything is about simplicity in tech. Ultimately, we're always trying to drive, even enterprise scale applications, we're trying to drive them down last mile, particularly in this age of virtualization, into simplicity for users. Apple said, forget what's behind the wall of the box. It's about how do I make your life better and make it simple. So when you take a company that's built on such technology that's inherently better than competitors, design that's inherently better than competitors, and you have the luxury, the genius, the foresight, whatever you want to call it, to not even have to mention those attributes, but rather to say, it's all about you as a customer and how can I make this simple. The elegance in that story is why Apple is the gold standard when it comes to marketing and tech. Okay? And it's a lesson, by the way, we can all learn in tech, is that it's not about the speeds and feeds. It's about what does it do for me? And no one has ever understood that better than Apple. And their brand moves in sympathy. Their brand is beloved because there was an absolute fascination with designing the best products and messaging behind those products, but from the perspective of you, the user, and how we make your life better.